back. This is episode 5 of the Doom is Dead podcast. Our featured guest today is one of my favorite people over the years, Dr. Sean, best known as the lead programmer of Odamex. Sean has worked tirelessly over the past decade to bring Odamex to the forefront of the competitive Doom scene. Not only is he an accomplished coder, but he's also one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. We were thrilled to talk with him about all things Doom, all things Odamex, and all things Sean. As always, Doom is Dead is sponsored by In the Keep at inthekeep.com and the Drowned God Cathala. So, someone that is here joining us today thought it would be a great idea to record this at 7 in the morning. So, because of that, you're going to have to listen to its story time. Okay? And hey, maybe if this story is a hit, I'll do a spin-off podcast. I'll call it The Mood is Dead. No question mark. I'll make myself laugh. So anyway, I think it was 2013, something like that. We were talking in the International Doom League board channel, and of course, you're supposed to be discussing league topics, things that are going on in the Doom community. And what were we discussing? We were discussing food. And it came out that I was working maybe 10 to 15 minutes away from where Sean's living, or was living at the time. And he said, "Oh, have you ever heard of this store? It's like a Costco without a membership." I said, "No, I have no idea." He said, "Well, if you want to go, I can just swing by your work and pick you up." So that's what he did. On my lunch break, he came by and we went to this store, and I walked in and it was like a kid in fucking Disneyland. It's it's a store that sells stuff in bulk, pretty much mostly to restaurants. But ever since that day, I go shopping there just for my regular groceries, and it was like the greatest revelation. It's all really affordable, and so I just have this image in my head of they were playing some pop song or something, and Sean was just dancing down the aisle on his own. It's pretty funny. So I don't know, that image to me, ever since that moment, he's always been like very easygoing, super helpful, super friendly. If anyone has an issue with Odamex, he's always willing to help. He doesn't think of himself as above anyone. The perfect example of what you'd want in a lead programmer. So for that and so many reasons, I'm glad that he's joined us. Please welcome Dr. Sean.
Hey, Sean.
Hey, thanks, gentlemen. Yeah, there's one thing about me, and that's a complete lack of shame. The other is definitely a love of 10 pounds pastrami for $18. You just can't beat that.
No, I mean, I can't even believe, like, I'm telling you, like 30 burgers for $25. I'm shilling for a corporation now, but so that was very shortly after you kind of just appeared in the Doom community. I mean, for years, Odamex had struggled to make a footprint in comparison to ZDaemon and Zandronum. And as far as I know, you just kind of showed up out of nowhere and started submitting code and fixing bugs. And you just, you became a superstar like overnight. So I don't know. I assume that you have some history with Doom, earlier in your life. But why don't you tell us a little bit about like maybe your gaming history and how you first discovered Doom, and then that leads into when you just appeared as the savior for Odamex.
Sure. Well, how did I get into Doom? I got into Doom because I was super into Wolfenstein 3D. When that came out, shareware, I had the registered version as well, and got into making my own maps, got into modifying the sprites, things like that. So I was definitely tuned in and awaiting Doom. I knew it was coming. Yeah, it was a big computer upgrade to get 4 megabytes of RAM in your computer at that point on a 386. So yeah, that was pinching some pennies there to save up to get that RAM so that when that shareware Doom came out, I could drop it in, and it was absolutely mind-blowing when that came out. So I guess I would have been maybe 13 years old, middle school era. And so that's what I got into with Doom. I tried some mapping around that time. really didn't get much into multiplayer because it was multiplayer over modem, and the old 2400 baud modem that I had just couldn't keep up. I played 1 or 2 games of multiplayer when I finally got a 9600 baud modem and so forth. But by that time, Quake had come out, so I got more into that and kind of left Doom alone for a while.
And this is still like the payphone era. That just got really expensive if you play it for too long.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about you play an hour game and it's going to cost you $30 or something at the time. So you're definitely paying for long distance, like almost across town at that time.
Yeah, I remember actually playing like that in like 1994, and of course my parents behind me were like, "Are you already wrapping up? Are you done? Are you done?" Just counting the seconds on the phone.
Oh yeah, well that, and if you didn't have that second phone line too, nobody could get a call in. Or in the middle of your death match, somebody does call in and it drops you from Doom. Yeah, that was terrible. But through high school years, I played some Quake, and then just kind of generally forgot about gaming as a whole. And that was all through college, and into my 20s. Then I was working a dead-end job with a couple of fun younger guys that also played Doom when they were 5 or 6, a little bit younger, but still remember playing it. Okay, so fast forward, it's 2012-ish, and I'm kind of working a dead-end job. And I find out just from chatting with the people I'm working with that, when they were younger, they played some Doom. They remember themselves as being, much better than they probably were. But at the end of the day, we got into some bragging and enough of that. And, you gotta actually put your money where your mouth is. So I decided to find out what sort of multiplayer Doom setup we could get for our office LAN. I've always been a big Linux proponent, and really that when I looked for multiplayer clients, Odamex was the only one that fit that bill, where I could run a server with both Windows and Linux-based clients in our office. So I installed Odamex, fired it up, and we just went batshit crazy. Playing probably 3 to 5 hours every day for 2 months, just in our own little world. And eventually I started to create some maps for our group. That eventually turned into the staff1.wad file. But these maps were really just designed for our particular play style. Some of the guys I played with really were adamant that spawn frags were, the bane of the civilized world. So that's why you'll see in that map set some kind of protected spawn areas on maps, 2, 3, and 4, just to give the guys a little time to get their shotguns up and things like that. So one thing that we found was really, really cool with Odamex was the WAD downloading feature. It made building new maps iteratively, and I would do 8 revisions of a map in a day, and we'd be playing a new revision every 15 minutes or something like that. So getting everybody to download via the Odamex server was really a key feature. And eventually we opened up to broadcast our server on the Odamex master server. Soon after, the riffraff started filtering in there, like Ralphus and Hex and so forth, and some of the other strong Odamex community members. And they really liked the maps that we were playing with, and they liked playing with my group. There was a lot of camaraderie in that. And then from there, I found the Odamex team on IRC and reached out to them. They had some bugs that needed to be fixed, so I took a look at that. And fixing about 3 or 4 bugs at that point made me the lead developer. So it kind of snowballed from there.
I'd like to ask, you're talking about mapping for your specific closed group of friends. Mm-hmm. So how did you actually map that? Have you been looking at some other maps out there that you've been trying at like we are not happy with these maps, so you tried your own, or were you mapping sort of like your own organic style that would fit just your group, and you had not much experience with the outside world maps?
That's a great question. So back when I first got into Doom, you could watch your vanilla LMP demos, and that was really my only exposure to deathmatch. So whichever WADs I could find that had some real good multiplayer demos, those stuck in the back of my mind as great WADs from that era. So for me, I really have a soft spot for the Danzig 1 and 2 series. And so when I started playing Odamex with my work crew, we tried some of those maps, but they were a little too tight. We were just sloppy players all over the place. You have a 96 unit wide wall or wide hallway, and that's way too narrow for how unskilled we were. So I made kind of a dumbed down version of some maps with some nice wide hallways, but multiple ways in and out of a general area. But I would say I just kind of made a dumbed down version of what I liked about that Danzig 1 and 2 series.
Yeah, those sort of mazy factories, or whatever you would call that style.
Yeah, especially I would say my favorite of the group is Danzig 1 map 11, which is also Dwango 5 map 2.
Mm-hmm. Which is
so you'll see some inspiration there in my maps.
Now, are these maps that you made, are they early iterations of what Staff became, or is it actually the same maps?
Yep. Yeah, the same maps. I did 100 revisions of it. In fact, I just logged in my Dropbox the other day and could actually go back and look at revision number 70 and compare how different things were. So it was an interesting trip to see how where various landmarks in some of those maps ended up.
Right. When you opened to the outside world, so to say, and you became a part of UD, that probably meant that your taste or your style had to start skewing towards where the community was. So is this something you can actually see in those later revisions, that you would cater more to where the community average was, so to speak?
I would say map-wise, no. Map-wise, as far as layouts, I've kind of just done what felt right for me and my group. And if my buddies were getting hung up on a piece of the map, or they thought one area was a little too spammy, we'd go in and I'd tweak it. But I didn't tweak things based really on the larger community. I wanted to be really accessible. My later maps, I did add more detail, more variety of textures, things like that, which definitely was inspired by sticking my head out a little bit and seeing what more modern mapping looked like.
So the outside artist spoiled just a little.
Just a little, yeah. It's not where I was entirely a tribe, a lost tribe in the Amazon, let's say. I got a little bit of exposure to an explorer, and he gave me the clap.
The civilized caveman.
That's going on my business card.
All right. So then you became the lead developer of Odamex just in time for some dramatic changes in IDL, which was the prominent CTF league and the biggest competition in Doom at the time. Basically, this is around 2013, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, there were IDL was going through some radical changes, because up to that point, we were using just the old version of the daemon, which was 1.08. And we used that for years at that point, and it became growingly, ancient. And but the problem with the new the daemon version 1.09 and so forth from that point was that first we would have to kind of either use their master, or we would have to run our own servers, but we didn't like the netcode that much. I think later on they even acknowledged some of the issues, so they just disabled demo recording altogether for over a year. That was crazy. So we had to look elsewhere where to even play our CTF games. And Zendronum at that time was a hot mess. So basically, when you started messing with Odamex, we definitely were looking at that from moment one with great hopes and expectations. So can you kind of clue us in how that went?
Sure. I think we just got a lot of momentum behind us with each release. We were putting out a release every month or two. Some of them were minor point releases, but each one really improved the user experience in Odamex, as well as fixing long running bugs or bringing in new features from ZDoom 1.23 B33, I think. And so each time we brought in some of those features from ZDoom, they were really at the request of some of those CTF players, and I think that was something that was in the back of Ralph's mind, and that's why he made some of those requests. Unbeknownst to me, I wasn't really aware that that league was eyeballing my work for a potential move at that point. But I think eventually we got to the point where it was a rainy Saturday. I had nothing to do, and I just started experimenting. And I sent the Odamex team a screenshot of what I was working on. And it was Ralph's magical ice forts. And it at that time, Odamex did not have any slopes at all. So it was a screenshot.
Can you tell us why there was actually a reason for that at
that
particular point?
So Vanilla Doom did not have sloped floors or ceilings at all. Everything was completely flat. And so probably back in 1998 or so, Randy added slopes to the ZDoom 1.23 client. Odamex is based on ZDoom 1.22. And the reason that it is based on 1.22 instead of 1.23 like ZDemon is that that was the last release that could be GPL license compatible. And that was very important to the team.
That was because of the Raven license, right? Basically, Hexen
a couple of things. Yeah, so you're right. The Heretic and Hexen code was initially not released under a GPL compatible license.
That happened only in 2016, 17, something like that. I think it was re-released.
It was relicensed certainly around the time that I was involved with Odamex. So I think it was maybe 2010 or 11, just prior to my joining the team. But previously, the Odamex development team had to go through the ZDoom 1.22 source code and remove all of the Heretic and Hexen code. And then I added a lot of that back to be ZDoom compatible and really to offer parity in terms of physics with ZDemon and the ZDoom 1.23.
The other problem was that slopes themselves were taken from Build.
Exactly. Yes. So Build is the engine for Duke Nukem 3D, and it was made open sourced, but it has a very particular license, and that license is not at all GPL compatible. So we could not borrow any code from Build or from any other software that used Build code. And by that I mean we couldn't get code that was originated in Build from another software.
Basically, the idea was that build code was released with educational purposes only license, so it couldn't be technically used for any commercial purposes. And I think that was also later, at the request of some GZDoom developers, changed. They directly contacted Ken Silverman for an exception or something. But yeah, back then it was something that the Odamex developers made a huge deal of.
Yeah, it definitely was one of the center pillars, let's say, of how we develop Odamex. Is that everything we did needed to be GPL version 2 compatible.
The license purists.
Yeah, well, this the Doom community. You have a purist for every niche. License, vanilla settings, modern settings. We're just a tunnel-minded group of people. So with regards to the slopes, because Odamex could not use the slope code from ZDoom 1.33, for years Odamex did not have any slopes. So one rainy Saturday, I was just tinkering around with some of the physics and figured out how to implement the physics of a sloped plane on the Ralph's Magical Ice Forts map. So I sent a screenshot of just a player standing on that ramp. Really, he's not standing on top of anything. The ramp's invisible because I had not worked on the renderer portion. But that was enough to really say, okay, this is an undertaking I can actually do as far as implementing the slopes into Odamex, because I end up with a absolutely massive branch. It's something where I just developed it in secret because we wanted to make it kind of a big reveal for the community. So it ended up being, touching almost every file in the Odamex source code, thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of change. But it ended up definitely being worth it, because it was the final push that gave us all the momentum that we had to get a lot more support from the community.
And I particularly remember the big reveal, which was the YouTube video with the Wagnerian music. Mm-hmm. that was really a big deal back then.
Yeah, I think Ralph did that all overnight one night. But yeah, it was definitely a nice moment reminiscent of 2001 Space Odyssey. He did some really nice videos previewing our 0.6 release, which is where we added that sloping code.
Right. So with this out of the door, the IDL board, we decided that we would run a season of IDL on Odamex.
Well, I think there's a little backstory to that as well, because for people that don't know, Ralphus ran the IDL for the first 9 seasons, and then I took over for the 10th season. And I think it was always sort of rattling in his head to eventually, or he had plans to move the IDL to Odamex when it was playable enough for him to be able to convince the player base. So when all this stuff started happening, that screenshot that you're talking about, he sent that to me, and it was like, this is it was like the biggest thing that had happened in the Doom community in a long time for us. And so it was really cool to see that was happening. And, we make it sound so easy. I don't think it was easy to make the transition. It certainly wasn't easy for you to, implement slopes itself, but also just the huge community shift that was behind moving from something like ZDaemon, which had been established with a lot of these players for almost 10 years, if not more, to just make that shift almost, within a 6 month to 1 year period was super. It was just huge, and it was almost community shattering. Like, some people couldn't grasp it, but I think it was necessary. And I think I look back on the decision to move the league over there, and I still think it's necessary. It was just a time where we needed a change, and it was almost kismet that you came on when you did. So I don't know. I felt like pointing out that, it sounds like all, fun and games, but I think there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that maybe people did not see and they weren't aware of. You kind of waded your way through that like a community veteran as opposed to someone that had only been around for a short period of time.
Yeah, I got known the community very quickly, let's say.
But it's also like you just became the right man at the right time in the right place. Because, yeah, as I was saying, the old ZDemon client was basically at the end of its lifetime. We really couldn't use it anymore. Our options in the other ports were limited. So this was exactly at the right time. So that was... we changed over to Odamex and we played the season. And then there was like a lot of friction during the transition period because things weren't exactly completely smooth.
Yeah, definitely. There was some behind the scenes friction. There was some, friction that was out in the open. From my perspective, I think the hardest part was that I became much more in a support role for the port as well. I was supporting users, 4 hours out of every day. And that kind of took away from the time that I could be developing new features and so forth. I ended up meeting some really, really genuinely great people in that community. And then there's some people that, like every other gaming community, they're just there to cause some shitstorms.
So you basically was almost like a point man and the lead dev, so not in the way the other ports are sort of structured, where the main dev almost summons themselves away from the community and someone else does all the talking. So was that draining?
Oh, it was absolutely draining. We're talking 12 plus hours a day focused on Odamex one way or another. Plus, I think I was probably, I don't know if I played in the IDL that season. It may have been the next one, but, I was very active with playing as well. Because if I feel, why develop for something that you're not going to actively play?
Mm-hmm. If I can speak for myself, like the main worry wasn't actually the feature set back then, but a different feature that you implemented back then, and that was a new netcode.
But that's not just one feature. That's probably 24 features.
Right. So I asked you to prepare for this a little bit. Can you explain how the hell even like the netcode in the client-server structure architecture works?
Sure. Let's just kind of go through some history. Okay, I'll start with just Vanilla Doom. That's a peer-to-peer lockstep networking synchronization method. What that means is that there is no client and server. Each client is considered the master. So everyone maintains the same state, and the state of the game does not proceed until everyone has everyone else's input and has processed that. Right. So it's fantastic if you have a very low latency LAN that you're playing with, but it simply doesn't work over the internet, where if you need to move forward in the game, but you're still waiting on a packet from a player, across the country from you.
Right, and there was always perfect synchronization because everything was deterministic, and you just got like a command that the other player moved forward, turned this rate, and shot. And the engine just translated that into everything, and it was the same for everyone.
Absolutely. So what you saw, you're seeing the same timeline that all the other players are seeing. And when we talk about netcode, really, you're actually talking about various timelines based on each client's perspective or even the server's perspective. And yes, the original Vanilla Doom with the peer-to-peer lockstep, it maintained perfect sync, and there was really only one timeline in the game. So that made it very simple to implement. It made it very reliable and satisfying from a player's perspective, but it doesn't scale to the internet. So probably the next evolution of multiplayer gaming for FPSs would be Quake, and more importantly, Quake World. I believe this same scheme was also used in Quake 2. It was separated into a client-server architecture where clients could join the game already in progress. So it brought a plethora of new features that were essential to internet play that we know today. One of the key features that was developed for Quake World and was not in the original Quake is actually where your client's allowed to predict where his own position is. So in a client-server arrangement, really the server is considered the master as far as the game world is concerned. So the server is the only entity that really has authority to say, Rocket is in this location, this player is in this location. So in the original in the original Quake netcode, a player could move forward or press the forward button rather on a keyboard. That would send a packet to the server. The server would process the physics on that and move that player forward, and then reply with the player's new position. And only when that player received that reply from the server was the player's view changed to reflect that forward button. So there was basically view latency. So the player's own point of view had round trip latency to the server. Quake World is really where that changed. So in Quake World, the client is allowed to predict where he's going to end up after his series of button presses, but the server still has the authority to say, no, you didn't really end up there. You ended up over here because you hit a different object in the game that was moving. That client prediction really is kind of the first introduction of a second timeline in the world. So when you have client prediction, a client predicting his or her position, they're really looking at a timeline that is roughly half of their round trip ping time ahead of the servers.
The infamous Quake World deltas.
Yeah, definitely. So in doing that, you've introduced two different timelines. You have the server's timeline of the world, which is really the authority. And then you have this client's predicted timeline that would be 100 milliseconds ahead of the servers if the client had a 200 millisecond ping. So that's really where things start to go off the rails if you don't add additional ways to mitigate the potential errors of predicting and pretending that you're in a certain position. Then some other improvements were made for Quake 3. Some of those are to essentially send smaller updates of the positions of players, objects, etc. And that's really just a way to compress the packets, but it doesn't fundamentally change the structure of that architecture. So that kind of covers how we do netcode as a whole. I would say one of the other key things to be aware of is with the Quake architecture, the server will send both reliable and unreliable packets for different messages or events in the game. For instance, if the map ends and the game should be going to an intermission, the server will send a message to all the clients, and it'll be a reliable message to make sure that they get that message. That this map's over, we're going to go to intermission, show the scoreboard, etc. For other things in the game that are more of state updates for game objects, such as a player, a health pack, things like that, the game will send, or the server will send, unreliable messages to all the clients. Those unreliable messages are not guaranteed to be received by the client. So in other words, they're sent once. The server doesn't care whether or not the client acknowledged receiving it. It's sent once.
Right. So you can have like a separate timeline where that medkit wasn't picked up actually on your side, but the server doesn't care if you see it or not.
Exactly. So you'll have visual desynchronization as well, because if you had dropped a packet or a packet was lost on its way from the server to your client, indicating that this medpack is no longer there, your client will continue to draw that medpack if it didn't get that unreliable message from the server. So that kind of is the cause of something like a ghost monster or a ghost player. Those are just terms the community will use when there's a desync and the server removes a particular object, but a client does not receive that message.
Yeah, so those co-op monsters that just stood on your side, on your client, and did nothing, and you could shoot through them, and it did nothing. They basically just weren't removed.
A few things on this. So, in your estimation, would you say that this method of netcode is the most accurate way to have players on the internet playing in a server hosted in a different location when the players are in different locations?
I would say the unreliable packet method that kind of evolved out of Quake 1 is definitely not the best way to do this. It's just what the Doom community has adopted from an early standpoint, and has not spent some time to revise that message scheme, that state synchronization scheme. There are other FPSs that have done it a lot better. One in particular that strikes me is one called Tribes. And instead of sending unreliable messages about states, it will make a guarantee that eventually the correct state will be sent. And that involves the client needing to acknowledge when he receives a packet from the server. So if let's use that medkit example again. If in frame 1 the server sends a message to the client to remove this medkit, the server will continue to send that message to the client until the client acknowledges it. The server may not send that same message every frame of the game. The next time it's time to do an update for that medkit, and that may be every 5 frames, it may be every 10 frames, the server will eventually send that message again to the client and keep sending that message until the client acknowledges having received that packet. And that's a much more reliable way to maintain sync. Anyone that's played Doom multiplayer knows that there are a million little corner cases where the game goes out of sync. And I don't think any ports have gotten it right yet, because we're all using, the older, flawed Quake World style messaging.
Right. The advantage of this Quake World style messaging would be that it generates lesser network traffic, right?
I would say that's probably not necessarily true. The way that the Quake World messaging is written, it's very naive. So it will send a full update every time. Let's say it will send the position of all of the other players in the game every frame. So it's going to send all of that player state for each other player object. It gets to be quite inefficient. For instance, if a player doesn't move, the server will still send an update about it, including its position and everything else.
But if you also clue in a possibility of high packet losses, then the reliable way when the client needs to also reply and the client just doesn't reply, then it leads to like a lot of repetition. And we had, and basically what I'm saying, we also had corner cases, like an ideal player who played over a satellite phone from Alaska. Just throwing this out there, that you have a corner case for everything in Doom.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's if just as a side note, one of Odamex's goals is to maintain vanilla Doom compatibility with, especially with the LMP recordings. And so for every bug in the original Doom, there are dozens of these recordings that kind of exploit and showcase that bug. And you could make the slightest change. For instance, I made a change to the texture loading system in Odamex, and I broke some of the physics code in the process, hitting a very minor corner case on map 7. So Doom is just an exercise in corner cases and how to mitigate them, and you really do have to be cognizant of every one of those corner cases. You can't just do something that's a sensible design, because Doom will say, nope, what about this? What about this? What about that?
Yeah, the determinism has to be maintained.
Yeah, definitely.
From a player's perspective, the thing that I used to hear all the time was that we were getting killed, quote unquote, behind walls. And so I was always led to believe, from talking with you, and especially with understanding how your approach to Netcode, that it really is the way that you've structured it is the most accurate way to have shots connecting, and you're actually getting the most accurate viewing of what's actually happening on both players' screens. So could you talk a little bit about maybe the visual aspect of it that players seem to struggle with when they were coming from another port over to Odamex? Because I think what I touched on a little bit before was people were so used to the way that, for instance, ZDaemon ran, that when they came to Odamex and the way that you handled the netcode was different, and it was difficult for them to get used to. But it didn't mean that the netcode was wrong. It was just handling, their connections differently.
Right. Just to intersect, there was a habit of leading your shots over at the daemon back in the day, because like if you were targeting a lagging target, slightly leading it would help you shoot it when the reconciliation on the server side was done, which is one way of doing it.
Yeah, that's really putting the onus on the players to know which other players are experiencing lag, so they can compensate that way. So I'll give a quick summary, really, of which area of our netcode base Bones is talking about. It's often called just simply unlagged by the community. But what it is a method to compensate for latency with hit scan weapons. So if, for instance, you have a player moving across your screen horizontally, just from the left to the right, and you have a 200 millisecond latency, without any hit scan latency compensation, you would aim right at the enemy player, click the fire button, and your shots would miss. Because the server is going to receive your message roughly 100 milliseconds after you click the fire button. And really what you're looking at on your screen is 100 milliseconds old as well, because the server sends you, the client, the position of the player. And by the time you get that message from the server, it's 100 milliseconds out of date. And so it ends up where the round trip time of the update that the server sends you of enemy positions ends up being very important in this to latency compensation. So what the code does is when the server receives a notification that your client press the fire button, it will look in that packet to see which frame you had last received from the server. And that frame indicates essentially where all of the players are in the world. So if the server sent frame 1 to the client and the client presses fire and sends that packet back to the server, indicating I'm pressing fire and the last update I got from you was frame 1, the game may have moved on to frame 10 by that point. But the server will take the position of all of the enemy players from frame 10 and move them back to where they were in frame 1. And then it will calculate whether or not that client hit anything. And then it will move all of the players back to where they are in frame 10. So that's how the function works as a whole. Bones brought up a good point, though. That is sometimes visually jarring. So a client may press fire and at the enemy running across their screen, and a half a second later, they'll see blood splatter and their enemy die. So that's one jarring point of it. But what players migrating to Odamex were finding is really a corner case because they would feel like when they're battling with another enemy and they get themselves behind a corner to be cover, they will still die. And they feel like they were shot through walls. And it comes down to, in that case, you have 3 different timelines that you've got to reconcile. You have the server's timeline, which is the authoritative timeline. You have the enemy player's timeline, who is predicting his own position, and he may press fire before you, but you don't know that because of the latency. And then you have your own view timeline as well. And so getting those to gel is it's kind of what Netcode's all about. It's taking a situation like that and just putting enough smoke and mirrors in front of it to make that palatable. One of the problems that some of the other Doom ports had for the longest time was that they would base their hit scan latency compensation on a client's ping rather than just simply you basing it on the frame of the last update that client received. And by basing it on the ping, you're really just taking the average round trip latency between that client and that server. But one of the most frustrating parts of writing game netcode is that there's jitter. Jitter is a variance in latency from one packet to the next. So really on the internet, you never have a consistent ping to a server. It's always going to fluctuate. And those fluctuations really imply that you won't get accurate hit scan compensation if you base it on the ping. What you really need to do is base it on the exact round trip time for that individual packet for that update. Did I cover enough on the getting shot behind walls, or you want to dive into that more?
Yeah, I think so. One of the interesting side effects that I might have joined in complaining about was that it created kind of like a seeming of imbalance when, in particular, a low pinging player with a location really close to the server was playing with someone, let's say in Europe, with someone from South America, because obviously I would get reconciled almost to the same timeline as the server, but then I would see, so to speak, bullshit on screen in my client. And the server would then tell me, oh, well, you just thought you were safe behind that wall because the other guy still saw you. So that was when a lot of the players just felt that, even though the technical principle of reconciling the netcode might be correct. It just doesn't, reflect the physical world itself. Because all of a sudden, is it really all that reliable because with the guy that's dropping packages and everything, he's more of like the less reliable side of the game. And he all of the sudden we got to situations where it felt like high pinging players were trampling over people who they shouldn't be beating. So I'm not saying that it actually meant that the game was giving them advantage, but there was a sort of change of feel in these games where all of a sudden people were just getting rattled by what was happening in game.
Well, I think what that means is all of a sudden somebody's actually able to hit what he aims at when he has a high ping, and that's going to definitely upset kind of the pecking order of perceived skill as well. So that's one issue. But the other issue is if you felt like you got behind a wall before you were shot and you die anyway, you should have got behind the wall earlier.
I know.
but I can see it's definitely frustrating, as a player because you felt like you were behind the wall.
You're still timing it based on what you see.
Yeah.
And when your reality of timing it is close to the server, you expect it to, be the way you see it.
Yeah, you're expecting, when you press fire and you see, blood splatter from another player, and it's within 50 milliseconds, you have that perception that the rest of the world is at that low latency as well.
It was particularly frustrating because I wouldn't complain about this if I was playing on an American server. I would expect there to be some kind of high latency hijinks. That's okay. But if it happens on a server in Germany, that means what the hell, dude? Why am I the guy who's getting the raw deal?
Yeah, and it's not really the raw deal because it's exposed, but it's visually unsettling, and that's what Netcode tries to solve in general, and sometimes it's not very good at it. In a lot of other multiplayer games with maybe a larger player base, you're not often going to have people playing across seas. You're going to have lower latency just based on the fact that the community is large enough to have games within your locale. But Doom's definitely a small community, and so we have to do a lot of things to make it accessible to the largest number of players at once. And some of those are not capping, let's say, the hit scan latency compensation. We've experimented with only doing the compensation up to a certain amount of latency, let's say 100 milliseconds or something like that. And that's something we could do. But overall, I don't think the Doom community is large enough to have players all play within 100 milliseconds of latency.
Oh, definitely not. Also, I would like to say that Doom actually is probably one of the hardest games to get this right, because unlike modern games, Doom actually moves fast.
Yes.
All those games that are played nowadays, players are sluggish. Even Quake is blazing fast compared to later games. So reconciling a slower moving target is not as hard. Meanwhile, we're reconciling really, really fast moving targets at SR50 speeds and everything with hit scan attacks. Those are the worst possible scenarios.
Well, yeah, and particularly, I think I read some at SR50. You're essentially running at 40 miles an hour. And then you've got your opponent coming towards you at 40 miles an hour as well. So that's essentially 80 miles an hour in terms of how fast you two are closing in on each other. So yeah, it is incredibly fast. And when you throw in high latency players, it's an absolute nightmare, and you're going to get some visual anomalies for sure. My goal was just to make sure that people could have accuracy with what they were doing when they were firing. Accuracy and visual anomalies, they don't always go hand in hand.
Yeah, and to add to that discussion, well, first of all, you have two players coming at each other at 40 miles per hour. The big question really is what time did the train leave the station, and when is it going to get into Chicago, and what did it do? Anyway, I think in the days of old, especially at the IDL days, it was very rare to have European players, because the IDL was, in its infinite wisdom, strictly played on American servers. It was very rare to have European players actually win. And so I think that plays a big part into it as well, is that when people started playing Odamex and, they started to see that, oh, wow, it's a little bit more fair for everyone. So you could see, European players kind of getting more even, a more even playground to play on, and they were able to compete at a much higher level. And I think the skill variance wasn't really impacted by the netcode or their location. So I think that was another part of the jarring experience for them.
Right. Yeah. Like back in the day, there was you would try playing on another continent. It wouldn't go too well. And you would
do
go
okay, but yeah,
but you wouldn't really compete. You would go back and you would
Europeans
play.
were always runners, because they couldn't defend and all this crap. Yeah,
you could always just go back on your continent to your community, because there was a stronger, there was much more, like a bigger community back in the day. There was a lot more Europeans, or a lot more Americans to constitute their own separate communities. So if you wanted to really compare skills, you would do it with your own, in your own backyard, so to speak. And these playing with Americans in America, that was just for fun. But lately, the community is diminished. Let's be honest, it's not as big as it used to be. So now we're just one global community. We have to do with what we have. So it becomes much more important that actually it is possible to at least roughly compare skills over long distance.
Yeah, and so fast forward to today. Well, in 2013, QuakeCon ran the dual tournament on Odamex, as well as 2019. I mean, that must make you feel really. I don't think that would have happened without all of this work that you've done. And I found it to be, obviously, I did not attend QuakeCon in 2013, but having been there last year, I know a lot of work went into making sure that new releases. A lot of work went into making sure that it was playable to the level that the tournament organizers felt comfortable with. So how does having to make sure that something on a large scale like QuakeCon, how does that affect your I don't want to say nerves, but I mean, how does that? There are many aspects to it. You must be, number one, you must be proud of yourself, I would hope. But how does that make you feel? How does it?
There's a lot of what? There's a lot of potential for embarrassment.
Well,
on a global scale.
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of a thing where you're breathing into a brown bag to stop yourself from hyperventilating. When you're on a center stage like that, or at least your code is. The idea is just trust in the process of going through QA and having a good solid release. You don't want to be writing code at the last minute to bang out a new release. You want to have it buttoned up, 3 weeks in advance, and then just play test the shit out of it. But yeah, it was very much a feather in the cap back in 2012 or I guess 13 to be part of the 20th anniversary for QuakeCon. It was kind of interesting. I had some great discussions with Sponge around that time, who was running the show then. And the general impression I got was, and some questions I've gotten from the community was, why Odamex? It wasn't the most popular port even in 2013. What it came down to was that Odamex was, stable and kind of it's, the vanilla compatibility kind of plays into that. It feels like Doom, perhaps a lot more than maybe Xandronum does these days. Odamex is known for being kind of true to Doom, but adding on enough niceties. So it's more like how you nostalgically remember Doom, not necessarily is it the 320 by 200 pixel Doom that really, we used to have. So I think that was kind of one of the driving factors is if you're going to put a classic 20th anniversary Doom tournament, and you're not going to try to do Chocolate Doom, Odamex was probably the next best alternative.
Right, yeah. And this year, actually, the last year, the tournament was repeated. And this time they took full advantage of the advantages of modern structures. So we had a full deathmatch tournament and a TDM tournament. That's something you can't have in Chocolate Doom at all.
Yeah, it's a lot nicer when you don't just have to say, okay, the green and red are on one team. It's a lot nicer when you can have something structured and you have the ability to have a nice custom scoreboard and things like that.
Yeah, someone doesn't have to quick add on the fly. Yeah, these guys are already done. They reached 100 frags and it.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about the Odamex community today? Because moving the IDL over to Odamex, that eventually led to the creation of the WDL, the World Doom League, and that ran for several seasons as well. Currently on hiatus right now, but I think that league has had a really special opportunity, and it's afforded a lot of players the opportunity to play Odamex. And there are plenty of people still that are a part of the community. I know that something people give a lot of credence to that I never understood is that, I open up an Odamex launcher and there's nobody in a server. Well, okay, I don't I don't think that really means anything other than you might have to go online and highlight somebody to play. But also in my experience, if you just join a server, maybe someone from your old work crew will join, or just random people will join. They're just kind of waiting for someone to show up. But I think the community has kind of it's stuck together. I think there are long time Odamex supporters still hanging around, still trying to make things, to help improve things, to make things better. You've got people like Rude, who created a great stats program website for certain servers. And then also very recently you've had these big stress tests of like 200, 100, 200, 250 people, which kind of appeared out of nowhere. And I think that
they were actually, the Decino organized things. Yeah. Those are just big meme events, but yeah.
I think a lot of good things have happened out of that. I mean, you've got some people contributing code and trying to help fix things. But I think it was important to have that backbone of the community there too.
Just if someone doesn't know, Decino is a YouTube presence. I don't know if you could tell he's an influencer. He's an influencer in a Doom sense, because I don't think anyone who just creates Doom content has this much following on YouTube. He's probably the largest person on YouTube regarding Doom, if you don't count Civi or someone who does all of the old games.
Well, he paid me to join the server, so I don't know what he's doing with everyone else.
Oh, the big Decino money. Oh, I see.
All that money in Doom, yeah.
I wasn't offered. I see. But yeah, anyway, he's been growing his channel and everything, and he's kind of a purist, so it makes sense for him to do an online stress test in Odamex.
Yeah, that definitely came out of nowhere. I would say the Odamex community is just really laid back. I think in general there were some people that were playing on Odamex that didn't really want to be there back in the days when the IDL switched over from ZDemon to Odamex. But those players that weren't happy there have gone on to live a life of fulfillment somewhere else. And so the people that are around Odamex really, really just like the port, they like the community, and they're there to help. And that's really the most important thing, is that if somebody's there and they're happy to be involved in it and they're willing to help, yeah, that's what gets us across the finish line, I think. But yeah, the Decino stream, I think, is important in general because a lot of the people that were joining the Odamex Discord were, the speedrunners or the single player mappers, things like that. People that don't normally get into the Doom multiplayer community. So it's important not just for Odamex, but for Doom multiplayer as a whole to get some of those people interested in multiplayer, because that's the lifeblood of Doom going forward, is to get new players, no matter what. Doesn't matter where they come from. If it takes a large stress test streaming event to pull in some new players, that's fantastic.
Right, yeah, not fishing in the same pool, but kind of like expanding to new crowds, which is what we actually did try to do when we switched IDL over from the Demon, because we were really grinding on the same fields every season, and it just led to less and less of the same elitist people, just being holed up in their whole of I'm used to this, nothing should change, and that just leads to the death of community.
Yeah, stagnation is very much kind of the nail in the coffin for Doom. Once it's stagnant, its days are numbered, and that's really interesting to see so much longevity with Doom, and it's absolutely because of continued mapping and new game modes.
New game modes. Okay. So for the last 5 or 6 years, perhaps longer, I've taken breaks in between, but I'm really hoping that Odamex could, and I've seen some progress on this, but Team Last Man Standing and Survival especially, I think having Survival added to Odamex would create, because if you look at like Thursday Night Survival on ZDemon, Xandronum had one for a while. Even the US Quake community does their little survival event. I don't mean to say little, but they do their survival event, and it's quite popular. So, do you think that there's a possibility of Odamex adding some new game modes to attract new players anytime in the near future?
I definitely have seen some code heading in that direction. Both James Dunn and Chow have kind of been collaborating on something like that. So hopefully we'll see it, get into one of our major releases in the future. It's probably not something for a minor or a point release. But yeah, it's kind of the ball's in their court for that. And obviously they are energetic and really have been doing a lot for the port lately. So I'm glad to see whatever they come up with on that. Ultimately, my goal, and I'm not sure if I've got the time for it, would be to take the Doom game logic and write that in Python, so that we have a fully scripted game engine. And really, the goal behind that would be that you could have a lot more power than you would with some of the other scripting technologies, let's call them, like Decorate, etc. And my goal with that would be to kind of be able to quickly make a disposable game mode so that we can just get some new content here. I don't want game modes where you have to modify the Odamex engine. I'd rather have it be something scriptable and have the client server sync just kind of happen automatically. So that's definitely not a near future thing, but that's kind of our long-term vision.
Like, do you know of Zscript, right?
But I've heard of it, but I did take a nice long Doom community hiatus while it was gaining some traction.
I mean, that's what is supposed to supersede the Decorate and ACS altogether in Doom. It's actually fully implemented now. It's poorly documented. But yeah, I'm not sure how viable would be to implement that without implementing all of cheesy Doom. That might be a big problem.
That's a very real issue for us when we're looking at features that ZDoom has that we may want in Odamex. It's the number of dependencies you have to bring in terms of code. So I end up writing a lot of things from scratch, and that's unfortunate because that's not the way to do it in the real world. But there's just a lot of baggage. If you pull in one small feature like Decorate, well, not small, but you pull in Decorate from ZDoom, and you're all of a sudden you are modifying almost every file in the engine.
In terms of the community, because there was, I should say, a weekly event for a while, run by a group of people, Odamex Nitro. It hasn't been run in a while now, but Odamex is right now the only port that really doesn't have kind of that weekly event. Is there anything that the players can do to get themselves involved, or anything that maybe you're looking for that would help the development of Odamex along, that players could do without, a lot of, like me, a lot of technical knowledge on, how Doom works? Is there anything that they can do to get themselves involved to help you out?
That's a great question. Kind of one of those things that you always have an idea after the conversation ends, but really it would be about organizing events, trying to introduce new players to Doom in general, helping take a new player and maybe mentoring them a little bit, play a couple of duels with them or whatnot, and kind of help build their skills, because I think new players in general get really frustrated playing against somebody that's been playing Doom for 20 years. And, they're at an elite level and the new player just gets crushed and rage quits. So I think finding a way to help new players kind of thrive would be a really important thing to do for the community in general and Odamex specifically. New players are how the port's kind of kept alive. I was a new player. I just happened to wander in and start playing, and because the community was good enough to me, I stuck around. But I could very easily have decided, no, these guys are dicks. I'm going to go play Minecraft now.
Yeah, so it's not just about dressing up nicely, ringing some doors. Do you have some time to play some Odamex duels? But you need to have some other new people around, which is a big problem in pretty much the entire multiplayer community, I would say. Like, you need to have other noobs around to kind of like help you out, not feel like the last kid in the class.
Exactly. You get like with me getting into Doom in my later part of life, it was about I had a group of 6 other noobs to play with. And we eventually got better on our own, and then we opened the doors and played with the rest of the community. But if any of us had just wandered into the community from day one, we would have gotten crushed, and it would have been a lot more frustrating.
So what about bots? Does Odamex have bots right now?
It does not. We're waiting on a ghostly death to implement them.
I think they go by Relentless Rodent, and they quit community actually. So I wouldn't wait too long on that.
Well, I guess you could name all the bots Ghostly Death if you wanted to, but I think that's a good way. When I open up, for example, if I open up like the ZDaemon launcher, it'll say, oh, it's like 30 bots are playing right now. And there'll just be one person in there playing against 4 bots. And I don't know anything about this person, but, they could be a new player and they're just throwing in some bots into the server and they're just trying to play around to get used to things. Do you see that as maybe a good step forward to get people, to get those new players kind of, get them started in playing, is to maybe have some bots implemented that you can throw into a server? Maybe, I don't know if there's some way to make it different than, kind of those mindless ones that we see. Maybe there's some special, cool, innovative way to implement them, but I feel like that would be a good step forward as well.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic idea. It gets new players skilled up. And to some extent, it kind of helps the issue of that chicken and which came first, the chicken or the egg problem of, okay, I open up the server launcher and all the servers are empty. I'm not going to wait around for somebody to start a game. Instead, if you got a newbie in there with some bots, well, you can do some killing. There's somebody on that server already, so you just join and all of a sudden you have a game. Once you have 2 players in a server, in Odamex real quick, you have 5, then you get 10. But getting those 2 players in the server has been our hard spot.
Yeah, and I think the stress test has helped. I believe I read somewhere that Ralph has said for about 2 months there were people playing Odamex 24/7, which I find amazing, only because that had never happened before. So and that could also make the stress test better, or make them more interesting if we were able to throw some bots in there. So yeah, I mean, I just, little ideas like that. You don't really think about them when you're doing something as grandiose as slopes or running a league or something. But I think all these little things, I'm glad to see that Odamex is kind of on its way to implementing some things that are going to make the community easier to traverse through and easier for new players to come and figure their stuff out, because I think we talk about this a lot on this podcast, but I think that's a big problem that we've had for the last couple of years, is just it's not easy for people to come in and figure stuff out, especially when there are so many negative attitudes hanging around. And you're right when you mentioned that the Odamex community is really laid back. I think that's not the norm that we're used to, and I think that helps. I think that helps bring, when the thing that I find interesting is when you have like a fervent Odamex supporter, they're not going anywhere. They're going to stick around, and they're going to be around for years, and they're going to help you any way you can. And I think that points to the leadership of you, Ralphus, Hex, all of these people. So it'll be cool to see the direction that Odamex continues to head in. So is there anything moving forward with Odamex? Like what are your larger scale goals, and do you have anything like anything maybe that you're working on that you think is going to be kind of saved for a bigger release instead of a point release? What do you have in store, and what would you like to work on?
Oh, well, that's one of my favorite questions, actually. So I keep kind of a roadmap of things I want to work on. We have a very loose kind of administration for our development team. In other words, work on what you want. So for me, my long-term goals, right now, I'm almost done with a branch for abstracting how Odamex loads resource files. So that would be WAD files. It's now also including zipped WAD files and PK3 files and dehack patches. So that's going to introduce a unified texture system. So you can use wall and floor ceiling textures interchangeably. It involves some render rewrites in a little aspect to no longer use Doom's internal format for storing graphics, the patch format. Now we simply use a rectangle image, and we use a color zero to indicate transparency. So that really simplified our renderer code as well in a lot of places. So that's something I'm working on right now. That's probably going to be in our .9 release. I don't like to break network protocol on a point release. Unfortunately, just the way Doom is, having a unified resource ID system so that each resource in WAD files has a unique global ID, it actually does break our network protocol a little bit for things like when you hit a switch and that changes a floor texture. So that's going to be a major release. And then looking out from there, a few items on my list is I'd probably like to get the UDMF map compatibility.
Nice.
I think that offers a lot of nice capabilities and kind of dovetails into doing some advanced scripting. I think the normal map format obviously is very limited for more advanced scripting, and so that's a precursor really to getting to do some cool stuff. Then other items on my list is I'm probably due to abstract our renderer as well. That would leave me the opportunity to one, clean up the existing software renderer code. Two, I could probably add a OpenGL based renderer pretty easily once we have our renderer code abstracted nicely. And then I could add on additional renderer features like portals or 3D floors or something like that. It's just a matter of how do I prioritize some of those things. And then the two other big ones. Oh, go ahead.
I was about to ask, what about gameplay stuff, like a full boom feature support? Is that
That is definitely on our roadmap as well. I may or may not be the person to implement that, though.
You're more of the technical guy.
Well, I mean, Chow might be. He's shown some interest in it, so that may be something he takes up. But that would be another thing I'd like to see in our .9 release is, at least play boom edit correctly.
Well, that would be probably enough.
Yeah, I think in general, with the rise of co-op in the community and a lot of boom-based maps for co-op, making sure that we have full boom compatibility is definitely going to be a priority for us.
Yeah. The standard of mapping has definitely moved from vanilla to boom, at least, which is like probably where Doom World is. Then there's, of course, all the ZDoom maps that are maybe outside of the scope what's possible for Odamex. But yeah, I would say that having both a full boom support and survival would be incredibly popular for an influx of new players.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm probably going to pressure Chow and put him in the hot seat on that one then. Okay, so the two other items on my list are really probably the most important ones. That would be the scripting that I've talked about before, and then networking. And I kind of look at those as going hand in hand. In my ideal vision of how our network code should work, I think each object in the game world should know how to efficiently send itself. What our current network code has is a series of statements in some of the physics functions and various other places that will compose a message and send it out to a client. We really shouldn't be mixing our physics code and the code that sends network messages across it. They shouldn't be in the same place. So one of my goals is if we move to a scripting system, take a more abstract way of sending the state of various objects in the game world. I think we can do that a lot more comprehensively in a scripting language instead of having our network messages sprinkled throughout our entire code base, which looking at other ports, that seems to be par for the course. But it's pretty gross from a developer point of view. But for networking, I'd like to be implementing the same network architecture as the game Tribes. There's some really good white papers for it. A few other mainstream games have given presentations at the Game Developer Conference illustrating how they used that network architecture in their more modern ones. One that comes to mind for me is Halo. Ended up using that for their client-server game sync, and it ended up being much more effective for them. So that's the direction I want to head in for networking for sure.
And Tribes was famously a very fast game, so it shouldn't be clashing with what we were talking about earlier, how Doom is
right.
Fast game.
The speed is very, very crucial. One of the things that speaks well is that Tribes really supports a notion of very small packets. The server should send 600 byte packets to the client once a frame, instead of more like what we do, which is potentially multiple packets of thousands and thousands of bytes to the clients. We need to develop a network message prioritization system, and by that I mean if you have a set of enemies that are in front of you on your map, the server should be sending you updates very, very, very frequently about the enemies that are right in front of you. But enemies that are 3,000 units away on the map, maybe the server can get away with sending you an update every 5 frames for that.
Right, so because the relative position doesn't change that much.
Exactly, and being off by a few pixels here or there when that enemy is rendered on your screen is a lot less crucial. So adding some intelligence into our networking like that it would be part of this goal here.
Of course, you will get someone completely break it by introducing some ridiculous corner cases, like some sort of a fucking ghost enemy that just warps around the entire map.
Oh, of course. Somebody's going to break something, and I'm not going to fix it, and it's going to be great.
One thing that I've seen so many people talking about is the True Color software renderer, and let's just start by, would you be able to explain that and why that's such an important feature?
Sure. So I want to say 2013 or 2014, we got a patch handed to us by James Dunn, who came out of absolutely nowhere as far as we could tell. And this patch was just kind of this proof of concept of really taking the 8-bit or palletized Doom engine and allowing it to be rendered in true color, 32-bit color. The code itself, what it does is it does not use the regular Doom color map scheme. So the Doom color map scheme is a set of palette translation tables. And as the renderer will render the scene, a long hallway, let's say, will get progressively darker as it gets further and further away from the camera. That's accomplished in the Doom renderer by using color maps. So if, let's say, for instance, you have a all-white wall texture. So as the renderer is rendering this all-white texture further and further away from the viewer, every so often it will look for the next appropriate color mapping table to use based on the distance away. And that color mapping table is designed to take that white color and make it progressively darker. So it's just a way to very quickly render that light diminishing effect. Now,
that's why in Doom the color progressions are famously not well optimized for, and red just descends into this
brown sludge.
Exactly.
Yes, and the problem is that this color remapping has to be done with the constraints of Doom's palette in 8-bit color mode. And so what it's doing is simply, like Stu was saying, taking red, and as the red is further and further away from the camera, it converts it to a darker color, which, given the Doom palette, starts to look gross. So what James did was he created a set of 32-bit color maps on the fly for. So when Odamex starts up, it calculates its own color maps for 32-bit color mode. In doing that, it's not constrained by the Doom palette at all. So it instead uses the original algorithm that Carmack used to generate those color maps, but it doesn't try to fit into that Doom palette. It just uses a natural darker shade. So your reds all of a sudden, when they're far away, are not brown sludge. They're just a nice dark red. And the effect maybe isn't noticeable at first, but if you ever bind a button on your keyboard to toggle between 32 and 8-bit color mode, it's definitely something that you'll notice. But when we say that, we want to present Odamex the way people kind of nostalgically remember Doom, that 32-bit mode, it just fits into Doom so well that you probably aren't going to necessarily notice it. Like I said, it's just going to feel like Doom.
Yeah, well, I can definitely say that. In current day community, there are palette artists basically who spend a lot of time just fine tuning the 8-bit palette for whatever performance they can squeeze out of it. But yeah, this is basically the way to introduce this to the wider audience, because they won't care that something looks gorgeous with those limitations on Chocolate Doom. That's not the goal with Odamex, right?
Exactly. We want it to feel like Doom as much as possible, or we want to be able to provide the option to be compatible with vanilla Doom. But really, we want to continue adding things that make it more refined and a better experience for the player at the same time.
Well, it is significant because, like Du said, so many people put time into the detailing, probably some of them even more so than the layouts. So to be able to display that, the way that it's intended is huge, I think.
Right, and the OGL ports oftentimes just steamroll whatever the maps is supposed to look like with something that is just pre-processed through a lot of their own approximations of the software renderer, and it just looks off.
Yeah, it doesn't have that same nostalgic feel. Now you can take something like GZ Doom and turn off various filtering and get it looking pretty close to software. And that's something we may look at in the future as well, but doesn't always have that same feel.
But would you like, when you're talking about using hardware rendering, do you even think that at this point, when you're still doing software only, is OpenGL even the way forward? Wouldn't it be better just to say, oh, screw this, OpenGL is not going to be around for much longer? At least not for our perception of time, because Doom is seemingly timeless, and it will most certainly outlive OpenGL. So why not go with Vulkan?
Oh, that's certainly an option too. From my point of view, really the key is to abstract the renderer so that you're able to have the geometry in such a format that you can send it to. It doesn't really matter which backend you send it to. In other words, be it OpenGL, be it Vulkan, you just want to be able to have a bit of code that can set up the scene that's generic, and then you actually take care of rendering it to whichever backend system.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, currently we do use an OpenGL backend just to render to the video card. In other words, with SCL2, we render to a texture. Then that texture is uploaded to OpenGL and just rendered to the screen. But that's a lot faster than writing directly to video memory. So that resulted in probably tripling our frame rate when we added that.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. I should say, I think the floor is yours now. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to mention that we didn't cover. I guess I'm mostly interested in how successful you think Odamex can be, and anything that we really didn't cover that might be important to mention to someone listening that has never played Odamex, or someone that may have tried it once and kind of struggled to find their footing and wants to try again. Is there, I know that's a really open-ended discussion, but I think
sometimes you get lobbing a softball.
Yeah, so I think you're more well versed in this subject than I. So I wanted to leave the floor to you.
Sure. I think really probably the most important thing is don't be afraid to ask for help if you're new to the game. We've got a great community. We've got guys that make a giant effort like Hex to welcome new players, help them get their game started. If you just want to launch an Odamex server for you and your buddies to play in private, that's perfectly fine. Just come onto our Discord. We'll help you get it set up. And then, when you're ready to branch out into the rest of the community, get some games started. Really, it's just don't try to be isolated or try to figure it out on your own and get frustrated and leave. Just ask for help. We've got very welcoming people.
So basically, don't do what you did at the beginning.
So I'm one of those guys that wants to figure out everything on my own, and that's kind of how I got so familiar with the Odamex code, was solving a couple of bugs. And in solving those bugs, I just trekked throughout our entire code base and got familiar with most of the aspects. So I'm habitually hard-headed like that, but usually it ends up in my favor, where I learn more through the process of struggling. But don't be like Sean.
But if you don't want to study the entire code base of Odamex, be sure to ask around their Discord, and they will happily answer you.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's our responsibility as old people to make sure that the new players and the young
Speak for
kids,
yourself.
I speak for, well, okay.
I'll throw myself under the bus. I'm old.
I'm approaching it. But I think it's our responsibility to help them not make the mistakes that we made, or to make the experience easier for them than it was for us. And that's what I see when I look at the Odamex Discord. And from you, and you mentioned the whole team, I mean, that's kind of been your MO for years, is, how can we make the player experience better? And really, like you said about Hex, welcoming them with open arms and saying, hey, any problems that you have, just let us know. We'll spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours trying to help you. And that's not always the hands-on help that you would receive in other places. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I definitely am here because I have a great team to work with. If I was working on another port that did not have the same caliber of people, I would not have stuck around.
I would like to thank you for joining us. I really can't remember the last time I had such an interesting and informative conversation. I think you are a true gem. And of course, if you're interested in Odamex, you can find them odamex.net. They also have a link to their Discord server, which I think is where you'll be able to find the majority of the information and players that can help you out, or if you want to become a part of the community, that's the perfect place to go. So thank you again, Dr. Sean. I hope that in the future we can have you back, because I think there's a lot of unfinished business, unfinished things that we didn't get to talk about. But It was really awesome to have you here. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's great to catch up with both of you.
Hey, Doom is Deadites. It's your friendly neighborhood producer, The Motherload, with a couple of plugs before we get out of here. Just want to point your attention to the fact that Kingdoms Take the Crown Doom 2 Dual Cup will be hosted starting February 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time Zone, and that will continue until the final bracket on March 14th. $1,500 cash prize. Go to doomfederation.com for more info.